Hi, everybody, and thanks for coming to this webinar. The topic today is going to be thinking about growth as a product manager. So my name is Arvind Chandaka. My background comes from Microsoft. I'm a product manager there. And today I'll be talking to you a little bit more about growth and some of the components behind it, and I guess how we could think about it conceptually from a product management standpoint. A little bit about me. I graduated Cornell University back in 2018 with computer science and several other degrees. Since then, I've been working at Microsoft, originally as a PM in the Azure space. So went across the stack in infrastructure, identity, security, open source, etc. Did a lot of work in that area, building intellectual property there, building out different kinds of services and so on and so forth, as well as helping with sort of the strategic initiatives around cloud's consumption as well. Today, I work on the cloud data security team, managing a portfolio of about 3 different products, things like Azure Information Protection, Microsoft Information Protection, and most recently Azure Purview, which is a unified data governance platform. So a lot of my background actually comes from more of the enterprise area, and this is just an important thing to understand when you're going ahead and doing sort of product management at different kinds of areas, because depending on whether you're doing a consumer business or enterprise different business, the way you go about addressing it would be different, essentially. A little, and I'll go into that in just a little second later on in our conversation. A little bit more background about me. A lot of the work that I did in open source in the past ended up in the creation of a book, which I just recently published. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. And I have also co-founded a startup called Carno Fleet, as well as help out with different kinds of nonprofits in New York City, where I'm based out of, and actually sit on the board of directors of one particular one called New York Edge. So, obviously, if you're interested in a little bit about my background and how I came to the roles that I'm in and the work I do, of course, reach out to me, via my LinkedIn page. Again, my name is Arvind Chandaka. Feel free to DM me on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out on other platforms, and would be obviously happy to chat. A lot of product management always, there's a lot of learning that you can get from just talking about people's backgrounds. So definitely want to have myself open for those kinds of conversations. So today's agenda, the topic we're really talking about is sort of growth, and it's such a broad concept. So we're going to start by sort of breaking down what really is growth and how you can think about it. We're going to talk a little bit more about data and metrics, talking about sort of the businesses that you may be participating in as a product manager and how that will change sort of how you think about growth in certain aspects. I kind of shy away from saying growth strategy. Instead, I'm going to say, thinking about how to go about creating a growth plan, essentially, for the different kinds of work that you may be doing in your roles. And ultimately, thinking about a little bit more on the strategic, operational, and tactical guidance side on how you can go about influencing growth overall. So I'm going to go ahead and talk sort of free form about all of these different kinds of topics. Again, I know that this is probably going to be recorded and then casted. So when this is, feel free to put down questions in the thread. I'll be sure to look at them and answer them as well. And of course, always feel free to reach out to me directly if you do have some additional questions regarding any of the topics today. So what really is growth? Honestly, there's a lot of buzzwords that are often thrown around with growth. People talk about growth hacking, escape velocity. There's a lot of phrases that tend to talk about from almost the marketing angle of things. And it is somewhat of a mixture of all of these different things and all of the different meanings of the buzzwords that are thrown around. And so it's very important to understand the grounding of what growth means to you in your individual situation as a product manager. And so ultimately that goal may be to drive the product forward in some type of circumstance. It could be from the revenue side, from the sales side, trying to get basically people to pay money for the product or service that you provide. And so, a deeper metric that would be very interesting here, especially if you're coming a lot from the enterprise side, is ARR, annual recurring revenue, and being able to understand sort of if you're working on sort of SaaS type of applications and products, how to go about increasing that revenue per year and understanding how you're trying to grow that over time as well. A lot of the things that I'll talk about here, by the way, are not only just important for product management. Obviously, it's a very important concept and sort of the framing of why we're talking about these things. But these are important for understanding how to become better at technology and business in general as well. And so if you're looking for career moves later on in different kinds of industries that are very metric and data involved, it's important to have sort of a consciousness and almost a tilt towards these kinds of things. But revenue, sales, ARR, that's definitely one of the places that you could be thinking about in terms of growth. User acquisition is extremely important as well. Adoption, customer growth, being able to just grow customers is a very big concept in general. And so, some of the underlying factors behind this could also mean metrics, again, that are more cost driven, such as what is the cost to acquire a customer. Many of you folks will know this metric as CAC. Being able to understand that, being able to understand how to go about calculating that, being able to create programs, in fact, of how to go about growing these different kinds of users and understanding trends overall. So that's a very important concept there as well. And all of this is going to sound a little bit generic at the beginning. And that's simply because, in different kinds of companies, there are different initiatives and different priorities that are important. And so trying to go about, describing the broad spectrum of things is probably the best way to go about making sure that there's sort of added value, again, for each of you guys. And so, in these cases, I think one of the biggest things in user acquisition and so on and so forth is actually learning how to build a program around it. And sometimes even, learning how to build communities around products. That's a huge trend that's going on, obviously, in a lot of productivity applications and things like that. And so it's always important to keep your mind out and be well read about how to go about creating these and actually executing on them when you're doing this in the workplace as well. Customer cohorts and conversions are similar to sort of the above topic. How do you go about collecting different groups of customers? How are they changing over time and seeing how they're being retained, or how many of them that you're grabbing as leads are being converted over into legitimate sales and members, and then from there, how many of them are actually adopting your product and actually using it for a certain type of lifetime, whatever that lifetime is determined. Being able to actually go through and understand that is, again, a huge piece of growth and something that you may be doing a lot, especially if you come from the consumer side. And so that's extremely important if you're especially thinking about some more of these sort of e-commerce companies where your customers are not necessarily other enterprises, but individuals, and the different kinds of individuals would be, ultimately end up being a huge part of your business, depending on how they go through this entire life cycle. And having basically pipelines and tools like CRM will help you understand how that will change over time. Profit and margins is obviously very straightforward. You do want to make sure that you are tracking well on these types of metrics that you want to be able to grow over time. If you want to make more profit, you want to think about sort of the different pieces that go into it. How can you make more revenue? How can you decrease your costs? How do you think about sort of margins in your products and your unit economics? These are all components there as well. CSAT is extremely important. It stands for customer satisfaction. This one is, I think, one of the very important ones that is sometimes very hard to quantify. And so having a way of going about quantifying it, especially if you're, coming from a smaller company that doesn't have really strong structure behind what this means, is extremely important in order to demonstrate, your different kinds of stakeholders, how much folks really love your product at the end of the day. Are they actually satisfied? Do they have problems with it? Entire supportability sort of contracts and programs are driven by this single metric alone, and being able to understand how that works in conjunction with working with support or any other teams that you might have is extremely important. And if you're, coming from a smaller company, something like a startup, being able to be scrappy in that sense is extremely important. And obviously, again, people who are listening in on this will come from many different backgrounds, and so I'm trying to be sort of as broad as possible in terms of the situations people come from. But I think, definitely if you are the one broad sort of heuristic I can give, especially for those who are in smaller organizations who have to be a little bit more mindful about how they use their resources, really have to be right about how they utilize all of these different pieces. And defining structure is sort of an underlying concept behind all of it. And so that would be sort of a great piece of guidance to go along with all of this, especially when you're thinking about vehicles to increase growth in all of these different kinds of metrics. How can you create structure behind all of it? We talked a little bit about retention and churn a little bit more, but again, this is very important whether you come from a consumer or enterprise background or even a startup. Being able to make sure you do these with the intention of reducing, in this case, the kinds of retention, reducing churn and increasing retention, and ultimately understanding also not just always the quantitative metrics behind everything, but the qualitative metrics of what are your customers saying? How do you go about creating a story behind this, a story that actually makes sense and is compelling? You don't want to create a story here without actually understanding what the true situation is, and you need to make sure you actually talk to your customers and gather data from them in these cases. And so, you want to utilize the different kinds of folks that you'd work with as well. And in this case, and if you have sales folks who create deep and meaningful relationships or account teams, I know at Microsoft we rely on them a lot. Being able to create those relationships will help you understand a little bit more of the sort of qualitative reasons behind all of the numbers that you're seeing. Different kinds of marketing channels are always important. Nowadays, there's a plethora of tools that you can use, especially if you're doing things from ad-based channels and things like that. And so being able to understand how they're growing over time using those analytics is sort of almost base sort of level at this time to be able to use. And I think being able to understand all those channels, especially if you are more of almost a product marketing manager, is extremely important. And by the way, I understand that there are different kinds of product managers that exist. There'll be sort of growth product managers, product marketing managers, true product managers, technical product managers, program managers, even. There'll be a huge plethora of them, but I think at the end of the day, all of these sort of tools for growth are just as important for you as they are for anybody, because as you're continuing to grow and become more mature in these kinds of sort of functional areas, the deeper you are that you get into the business, and to understand the business really well and understanding how to make good decisions, you really need to know all of these different features. And of course, especially if you're creating different kinds of products, ROI is obviously very important. It's one of the reasons we check to see if certain features are even worth building or not. And so having a understanding of how to go about calculating that is really great. And so, without talking about all of the other buzzwords that are in between, I think if you're driving the product forward, you're sort of addressing something in this list. I haven't covered everything to a T, but you get basically the main point here, that we want to go about trying to identify the right kinds of data that we need to use ultimately to analyze, and ultimately use that analysis to drive great decision making. That is sort of a huge point to drive home here. For data and metrics, I think, as we're sort of moving into more of the deeper topics, I mentioned things like being able to create structure, and measurability is exactly one of those components of structure. All of the things that I mentioned before have quantitative as well as qualitative aspects behind them, because the quantitative aspects are what you see in the data. Clearly, there are the analysis, what you see from all the data points that you're gathering, and then of course you have to create a story out of that qualitative to help understand what is going on with the business or product. And in this case, the sort of prerequisite to having that quantitative set of I guess really staples really is having measurability behind things. And so that would mean actually understanding if I have a product that is generating different kinds of telemetry. First of all, am I creating the right places where I can actually gather that telemetry from? Where is that telemetry being led to? How can I visualize it? Can I combine it with other kinds of data? And if so, what kind of tools am I using? Am I using different kinds of SQL databases? And am I using other like analytic stores? Am I just using a giant like log centralization tool? There are many ways of going about doing it from like a structural standpoint, but being able to understand, especially from a sort of almost startup or entrepreneurial level, how to go about measuring it is incredibly important. And even from my standpoint, where I come from Microsoft, sometimes we don't have the data that we need to be able to actually do a lot of this work, which means we have to critically think about where are we going to get this data from, how are we going to funnel it in, who's going to be maintaining it, and so on and so forth. And so I think from my standpoint, I try to go out and seek out a team to help build or maintain that telemetry so that we have that in place. This is not always going to be the case at smaller companies. Obviously, larger companies will already have something like this usually in place, especially if they're more mature. But I think if there isn't something like this, having the investments to do something like this is extremely important. And many times, if you're the lone product person, you might be the one who has to go about doing that. And so some of the things that will really help you is understanding how to go about creating different kinds of great dashboards. You see here this picture of Power BI, which is obviously a tool we use a lot in Microsoft. How to go about setting up these different kinds of tools. And ultimately, I think tooling as a broader spectrum is extremely important here, because depending on what you use, it can really help you basically give you the visual effects of what you want to know, and it can help you define that story of these growth metrics and so on and so forth. And so I think it's extremely important here. It's almost understated to how important it is, because I mean, ultimately you have folks who are data scientists and entire roles sometimes who are dedicated to this. So, depending on where you are in the spectrum of, the size of your company, there might be other folks who are doing this. It might have to fall on you. It's obviously a really great skill to have, and I encourage everybody to have this skill simply because it makes you more valuable from a career growth perspective. So I think that's again one of the big takeaways here. So when we're talking about sort of your business, I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier that whether you're a consumer business or enterprise business in any sort of subset sector, your business will have different kinds of requirements or prioritize different kinds of data differently. And so when you're looking at sort of growth metrics and data, what does this data actually mean to the business at the end of the day? And it's such a broad question to ask, but it's so different business to business that it's important to actually have the consciousness and self-awareness to ask that question. And I think, again, that's a big takeaway. You have to be sort of self-aware about what is actually important at the end of the day. And are you doing things that are aligned to sort of these main interests? So as an example, for Microsoft, having to drive cloud consumption is ultimately a big goal that is sort of led overall to mean that as we're becoming a more and more becoming a cloud leader at the end of the day, it means that we have to go about reframing how we think about our business in the future, and so that will really be a cloud bastion. And so cloud consumption today means that we will achieve that end state later on. And so when we go ahead and think about it that way, it means whatever I can do to align myself with work that helps drive that cloud consumption and whatever metrics are underlying that it means I should really be helping to push that. And it's sort of a very qualitative thing that we're talking about in this case, because again, it varies business to business. And so, for something like a security business, as you're building out different kinds of products and integrations and things like that, maybe it's understanding, well, what kind of data could I really get at the end of the day that will help make my intelligent graph much smarter? And so, being able to help increase sort of data ingestion at the end of the day might be a more relevant metric for me. And so, whatever I can do now to break that high level piece down into individual quantitative components and being able to drive each of those is ultimately where I can drive a lot of different kinds of value. And so, if we're taking that a little bit further, obviously that is a very business centric approach, and examples that are very business centric at the end of the day, and which is really good. But you also want to be very careful and understand that, usually as someone like an IC, which I mean individual contributor, likely what you are for some of the folks who are looking at this call, and trying to drive more value in what you're doing every day. Sometimes the business doesn't quite understand the customers as well as they do from the level that they're sitting at. And what you should be doing, especially as a product manager, is understanding what your customers are telling you, whether it's from a lot of the telemetry and the data that you're getting and being able to create a cohesive story about what they want, or actually just going ahead and sitting in calls with customers. I think that is one of the most useful things you can do. And especially if you're very particular about growth and being mindful about that, understanding and being customer centric is the key of being able to grow your business. And so the insights that you get from them are ultimately being filtered over to the rest of the engineering team to help drive the next set of features and things like that that are actually going to be valuable and help make your product stickier, or may help even you acquire more customers. And so having an ear to that and actually spending your valuable time talking to customers is extremely important. It's almost always understated for some reason. That cannot be overstated, basically, from my opinion. Thinking about a little bit more on sort of the enterprise versus consumer businesses, again, different metrics that I've described in one of the first slides here is sort of important to thinking about that. For enterprise, I think, if you're especially thinking about sort of annual recurring revenue and so sort of the metrics around there, I think the trends around that are extremely important. If you're talking about enterprise products, especially if you're making sales to individual folks and individual people in the firm, being able to understand how VPs of IT sort of see the problem at hand, and understanding how sort of other folks in their company also see the problem at hand is extremely important. Versus, consumer businesses are a lot more about understanding some of these more granular metrics. They want to know about churns. They want to know about your new monthly cohorts. You want to understand how they basically are changing over time, and being able to identify sort of lifetime value of a customer and things like that. And so these can change basically depending, again, on what kind of role you have and how your products are. But again, it only serves us a better heuristic to know that there are sometimes certain data that is more important than others, and you should not prioritize all data. And so that would help you prioritize your job, saving you the time to focus on the things that are important and actually creating a value add overall. And so that's ultimately, thinking about sort of the priority of the businesses there. And so the key here at the end of the day is really critical thinking. Again, very understated. It seems so broad to say something like critical thinking, but taking a step back, seeing how things are, taking some reflection time, especially in such a fast-paced environment, is extremely important. One of the things I'd recommend is having sort of a learning period. So for us, we obviously have certain kinds of cycles where we're doing a lot of work and pushing some sort of basically objectives that we might have for some X amount of time at a time, right? And so after that X amount, maybe we spend a week or so, or a little bit more, thinking about what went well, could we do better, thinking about sort of the broader trends that you've seen in the past semester or so, and being able to understand how you can put together that kind of mapping of all the learnings in order to basically make better prioritizations for the next semester. And again, it's sort of a feedback loop here in this case. There's so many ways you can go about it. There are tons of structures and frameworks that exist in sort of business journals and things like that. That would be really helpful. But I think at the end of the day, setting aside the time to actually going ahead and doing that would make you that much more valuable. And ultimately, part of the sort of tactical advice that you can take away is being able to ask actually just good questions, and the hard questions, and answering them honestly. This goes into more of the self-awareness piece of how can we do better. But if something is not growing, is it because you're not trying hard enough? You have to really ask yourself, are you actually helping drive a kind of program to actually succeed, and are you putting 100% of your effort in it? And if it's not that, how do you go about, defining what happened, in the sort of period where you were trying to lead this program? Were there other trends at hand? Were there external factors? Were there internal factors? And again, we could talk circles about all the different kinds of frameworks and feedback loops that may exist to help us ascertain exactly what happened in the business. But I think just having that mind towards questioning and being able to have that kind of important. And so I would highly encourage, just having that as sort of a corner stone of your toolkit, basically. So from this slide, I know from before we mentioned that I didn't want to call things a growth strategy. There are, growth strategies that obviously that you can follow. There are things that are obviously more skewed towards marketing. There are things that are maybe more product oriented. There are things that may be more sales driven at the end of the day, because growth strategy, again, is a very broad term. So I wanted to talk about basically creating a growth plan. And again, if you wanted to go and find different kinds of frameworks that would work best, I obviously encourage you to go about doing that. In fact, in product school, there's so many great folks who have come and presented these different kinds of frameworks that absolutely work. So I would encourage you to do that. But I think, having a high level understanding of how to go about approaching these things is extremely important. And so if you're trying to create a growth plan behind growing some metric or having some sort of niche goal within the work that you're doing, I think one of the great things that helps is having something called a OKR methodology. And so we use these at Microsoft, where we have things basically that are like objectives. And this would be a broad sort of statement of, let's go ahead and increase the feature adoption of this particular feature by 10% or so. So we're actually focusing on customers this time. And that's sort of the actual metric we might be going after. And so in this case, the objective overall would be to increase the customer adoption, whereas the KR in this case would be that actual metric, the 5% or 10% or whatever it is that we're trying to get to of whatever populace of customers that may possibly exist. And so actually these OKRs help force PMs to almost think of both the qualitative and quantitative aspects of what they're being asked to do. And I think it's really useful, especially from a team standpoint, so that your manager sort of is obviously going to be responsible for a lot of these OKRs, but you as an individual PM may be asked to go ahead and drive one or two or three of these. Again, depends on sort of your seniority. Maybe if you're one PM at a firm, you might be sort of owning all of it. But being able to understand how to go about divvying this up and creating basically broad, they're essentially user stories for the business, is extremely important. And it helps drive your work in a way that is very incremental, is very focused and provides, I think, personally, a lot of structure. And I think also in the creation of going through and running through that exercise of building the OKRs is extremely important because it helps understand, what is my denominator? If I'm going ahead and growing 5% of something, what is that 5%? What is that overall pool? How do I go about defining it? And it helps understand how you think about these problems with even more detail overall. So I think, running through the exercise of even trying to create it and then actually executing it is a fantastic way to go ahead and address the growth in your business. I know it works very well in Microsoft, and I highly recommend it as a strategy for many other folks. Again, depending on the kind of organization you work for, maybe you might help in writing this. Maybe you may not be because it's belonging to a really large PM owner. But basically, creating a strategy summary is something that really helps a lot too. I find it helps to even write one because it helps organize how the strategy of that one thing that you may be working on is particularly working. So even for individual OKRs, you can create strategy summaries. It doesn't have to be for that entire business division or something like that. So something like the cloud and AI division at Microsoft or something. So it would be really useful to always go ahead and create these kinds of broad summaries because it helps you understand, what's the context, what's the story behind everything, especially when, you as a PM may be working on one product, you might not know how, another sister product may be working on something that, almost relates. And just being able to go ahead and do that is a fantastic exercise and helps you understand a little bit more of that growth overall. I think related specs is extremely important. One of the biggest things that you'll learn, and I think it's one of the, I think it's a little bit overplayed, is you have to be a little bit political, right, to be a PM. You have competing priorities. You are sort of given a directive and you have to push it and you have to negotiate with different kinds of teams and their developers and things like that, how you're going to go ahead and get this created with a certain kind of timeline in mind and how you go about prioritizing it. And so, speccing obviously becomes a very important part of gaining ownership for, or gaining buy-in rather for certain kinds of work that you might be doing within the semester. And so just being able to understand how it's related to other specs and the other work that's being done is extremely important. Again, there's so many different ways of going about doing it, but I think, one of the things that's almost always overemphasized is how political it could become and how you have to go about negotiating things with different kinds of folks. I think that's always obviously the case, but if you go ahead and do sort of the first two steps right, then when you go ahead and create the specs for, say there's a PM who's working on feature A and there's a PM working on feature B, the PMA may end up actually being quite aligned with PMB, thus reducing a lot more of the sort of problems in hand. And this is something that may occur a lot more at bigger companies, and so it's something that I just threw in here to be cognizant of. But the ways you can find more alignment, the better. Basically, is the big takeaway there. And especially if you're talking more from almost a business PM kind of perspective, thinking about growing more into different kinds of markets or continuing to grow the current portfolio, these are decisions you might obviously come across. I think another decision is, how do we think about customers and how we think about listening to their requests? Does this mean the incubation of a new product or so on and so forth? These are obviously very tough questions to answer and things that you should always keep in mind, especially when you're sort of at those higher levels or you have a lot more control and being able to help make that decision at the end of the day. And so when you are sort of almost focusing on this go-to-market kind of mentality here, do you have the data to support it? And being able to come up with the high-level directive or the high-level qualitative statement and being able to break that down into the quantitative metrics that you need, and then being able to go and hunt after those quantitative metrics, and then ultimately creating the strategy behind growing whatever it is that you need to grow, you'll obviously be extremely successful there. And so these are some of the ways of going about creating a growth plan. I obviously have a huge tilt towards the OKR methodology. I hope you take a deeper look into it and that it's very helpful for you. And absolutely let me know, if you are working on different kinds of strategies and sort of frameworks that your company uses, feel free to share them. I'm always happy to learn a lot more as well, and seeing sort of the diversity of how different PMs operate in different modes. So we're sort of at the phase where we're talking a little bit more about strategic, operational, and tactical guidance. I always sort of use these three as a way of defining how to go about thinking of problems at work and things like that. Um, and I think the best way to describe it is sort of in this context where something that could be strategic is very broad. It encompasses entire divisions, entire businesses. It helps define that really high level strategy behind things. And so decisions that may be strategic in nature that could help grow your products or businesses, or things like community building. I mentioned before that there's a lot of productivity software that is being built, especially at the sort of early stage entrepreneurship area, where PMs are really focusing in on building out communities. And so communities almost create a flywheel effect where, as people are coming in building out things, say for productivity software, if you have a sort of a no code, low code platform where you could create things that are focused on automation, or automation workbooks that can be used within these softwares, then yeah, I mean, being able to leverage that is a fantastic tool. and that in turn brings in more customers that are willing to use it, and with more customers, there are more people that convert into being builders within the community and creators that help propagate this flywheel, which is obviously very good for your product because it continues to grow the number of users. So that might be something very strategic. Obviously, the operational and tactical things are sort of how to go about building it are a little bit deeper, but the strategic component of having a community is definitely there, and it's one of the things that you could think of. So that's one example. Another example that is, again, understated is actually communicating with your leadership. I think one of the really valuable lessons is being able to push back and being able to make a case against why we shouldn't be doing something sometimes, and being able to successfully communicate that with leadership, being able to have some tact and poise around how to go about doing it. These are sort of almost soft skills that you just have to be a little bit more aware of. And I think these are things you could absolutely learn, but sometimes actually being able to make a case and push back and actually stay true to the analysis that you might have done in certain kinds of work, and able to influence others is extremely important. And so that would be very strategic, because if you are able to make your case, it could create a strategic shift on how you should be going ahead and growing the product instead. And so I think that's always a great thing to have. These are just two examples. I think thinking strategically is always a good sign here when you're thinking about growth. But I think operational, modes are extremely important here as well. One of the things that I'll talk about is development methodologies, right? If you're a PM and you're working with devs, having a way of going about working and focusing on work with a certain kind of structure is extremely important. And shameless plug, I have actually authored a book that I mentioned earlier. It's called Developing Microservices on Microsoft Azure, or Developing Microservices Architecture on Microsoft Azure with Open Source Technologies. I created this with my co-author, Ovais. And one of the things we do talk about is, focusing on DevOps, a little bit of DevSecOps, and being able to actually understand how to go about orienting your team in a way that is poised for agility, being able to push out more code, being able to do it at a granular rate, and ultimately being able to make a team so much more operational, in a sense that you'll be able to actually continue pushing out more features. And in this case, that operational change may help you instead garner more customers because you pushed out the features that they exactly needed. And so there's a lot of things you can obviously learn from microservices architecture. That's just one of the things that I did as a shameless plug, I will be honest, but definitely check out the book more if you are interested. And feel free to reach out to me if you want to chat about it a little bit more. From the team's perspective, I think understanding how to go about creating teams, mentoring them, helping deploy them into certain kinds of areas is extremely important, and something that I think there's absolutely a lot of value in. We all have different kinds of capacities, and being able to do that capacity planning and making sure we're getting prioritized work done and learning how to manage them becomes almost a operational task. You may not necessarily be doing it, obviously, if you're not, say, like a manager of your team, but it is definitely an operational change that makes a huge difference, especially because it's such a large internal factor. And again, those are two examples. There's many different kinds of operational changes. I could, scorch the earth, basically all the different kinds of things that you possibly do. But I hope it gives you an idea of some of the things that you could possibly do in this end that would help, again, influence great growth potential in your products. Last is tactical. I think, this is something that would be extremely useful for a lot of younger PMs who are sort of just getting started in this area. Being able to think tactically about different kinds of things, being able to identify patterns and actually executing on the learnings that you get from the patterns that you see in different kinds of products is extremely important. And one of the ways that, as a young PM, you can have a huge value add. I think one of the biggest thing here is run experiments. It's we obviously have different kinds of frameworks like A/B testing and things like that everybody knows about. And it's a little bit more than that sometimes, right? Being able to design a great experiment in order to garner some sort of learning that will help you shift the way you think about a product is extremely important. In fact, it's one of the lifebloods of any company being able to work extremely well. And so as a product person, this should be actually a primary competency you should be able to do. And in fact, if I'm looking into different kinds of companies and how companies are composed of, I see that, this is pretty much one of the things they have to have in order to have a winning formula overall. And, I've met so many people that have displayed this kind of tactical knowledge of learning how to run different kinds of experiments that are really sort of the 10 extras that can help provide some of the best value in different kinds of firms and so on. I met actually a professor at HBS who's extremely good, Sam Clemens. I believe he's the CEO for Prize, and he's extremely good at this. I was invited to witness one of his classes once, got the honor to do that. And, he was showing us basically how you can think about, in that one particular class, about monetization strategies and how to experiment with them and ultimately get this one company off the ground to be able to use a monetization strategy that helped lead it to success. And so actually just being able to have that kind of thinking strategy and sort of the tactical brain behind it is extremely important. I cannot understate that as well. So, definitely you have to think of it in these different kinds of modes. I think they're just a really good classification of guidance that you can follow at the end of the day. And I would say, these are just some examples, but feel free, obviously, to think of different ones that you could use in your day-to-day job. Again, the folks here at Product School who have presented have done a fantastic job in doing things that fall into these 3 different kinds of buckets. And I highly encourage you to continue, checking out those kinds of videos here in the Product School to help bolster your learning. And so just the last sort of takeaways here, basically, understanding basically what growth means. It could be sometimes used as a huge buzzword, but breaking it down and actually understanding what it means to your business and helping prioritize what is important for your business is key. Being able to understand what our basic building blocks of a growth plan is extremely important. And then ultimately being able to execute on this sort of strategy or plan by learning some of the best practices, using guidance, being able to think strategically, operationally, tactically to help get you to where you're going is extremely important as well. And so I'll sort of end it there. Again, I want to thank Product School for this opportunity to sort of showcase a lot of this material here. I understand it's probably hard to get it done in our 30 minutes or 40 minutes or so, however long it took. So just wanted to say, if you do want to continue this conversation or you're curious to learn about more, please let me know. Again, my name is Arvind Chandaka. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, DM me, at me, and we'll continue a conversation from there. And I want to say thank you for listening.